Throughout the United States, there are varying forms of voter suppression that take place among all races, age groups, and identities. In this presentation, I will be discussing the contribution of insufficient education to voter suppression. One may think of voter suppression as a tangible action or event that is actively taking place against someone as they attempt to cast their vote at the polls. However, a certain form of voter suppression is ongoing and committed over great lengths of time. This form of voter suppression begins in the classroom with insufficient education and follows voters in various forms, often disproportionately affecting minorities. These forms include the poor quality of both civics and basic education that many Americans receive as students and the misinformation and/or lack of information they receive as adults. To actively participate in democracy, American citizens must first receive proper education about how and why to participate in democracy. The positive effect of education on voter turnout can be seen in the positive correlation between the level of formal education someone attains and their likelihood of voting. Those with college degrees have a higher voter turnout rate than almost any other subcategory of voters. The importance of education can be seen further in the role education plays in counteracting common voting obstacles, such as determining one's voting precinct after moving. College graduates are much less impeded by moving than those who have attained less levels of education. However, the civics education that sparks civic engagement and provides civic knowledge and literacy to young students is decreasing over time as both federal and state funding for these programs decreases. For over 20 years now, the National Assessment for Educational Progress civics exam has consistently shown that less than 25% of students are proficient in civics. This ever-persisting drop in civics literacy may be a result of America's apathy towards the issue of education. During both the 2016 and 2020 presidential debates, not one question regarding education was asked of any of the presidential candidates. Despite the evidence that the more standardized a state's education system becomes, the lower their voter turnout is, the focus of education in America has shifted away from an equitable, comprehensive, pedagogical educational experience for all and towards an ideal of individual achievement that results in standardized education and corporate servitude. This shift has left many minority students behind, creating educational disparities between white and minority students. On average, students of color attain lower levels of education and achieve academic advancement at a slower rate than their white peers. Twice as many black students drop out of high school before graduating than white students. These disparities may be attributed in part to the lack of quality education available to students of color. Schools with large minority populations have more underpaid and inexperienced teachers than schools with lesser amounts of minority students. According to the Center for American Progress, a 10% increase in students of color within an institution equates to a decrease of $75 in spending per student. In addition to disparities in basic education, Black and Hispanic students scored lower on the National Assessment for Educational Progress civics exam than white students did. Furthermore, students with lower incomes or disabilities also experienced lower scores. In this graphic, we're looking at 8th graders' National Assessment of Educational Progress reading scores from the years of 1992 through 2017. We can see that, on average, white and Asian or Pacific Islander students scored higher on the exam than American Indian or Alaska Native, Hispanic, and Black students. In the next graphic, we see the math exam scores from the years of 1990 through 2017, with similar results as the reading exam. In this final graphic, we're looking at the percentage of young adults enrolled in college by race and ethnicity from the years of 2000 to 2016. We can see that Asian students have the highest percentage of students enrolled in college, with white, Black, and Hispanic students following behind. As a result of the educational disparities that minorities face, many minorities also face difficulties when voting that white voters do not. During the 2018 midterm elections, 53,000 voter registrants were given a pending status for misspellings on their registration forms. 70% of these registrants were Black. Without proper foundational education, minority students become less likely to attain higher education, further decreasing minority voter turnout and suppressing the minority vote. In addition to experiencing educational disparities, minorities are also the most susceptible to misinformation as a result of their less comprehensive educational experiences. Beginning with one of the first steps of the voting process, voter registration, there is already cause for confusion among voters. Determining when and where to register and what materials are required for registration can be an overwhelming process, especially for lower-income voters who do not have immediate access to the tools needed to find this information. More confusion ensues when it comes to casting a vote, since many states change their voting rules often and without warning. During the 2018 midterm elections, Missouri was intent on implementing a strict voter ID law for the first time. However, a court order in October of 2018 blocked the strict requirements and required the state to accept diverse forms of voter ID. On Election Day, confusion regarding what qualified as an acceptable form of ID was widespread and caused many voters to be turned away at the polls. Additionally, voters in multiple states, including Massachusetts, Wisconsin, and New York, received text messages containing incorrect information regarding polling locations, causing more voters to be turned away. According to the Center for American Progress, voter confusion due to administrative errors and misinformation is one of the primary reasons for voter suppression. While voters need information about the voting procedure, they also need a reason to vote. This reason could come from knowledge surrounding a candidate's policies, background, or motives. But for people who lack information or the ability to understand certain civics information, it is difficult to identify the benefit of voting. By failing to provide adequate information regarding candidates and voting procedure to all voters, the voting system effectively disenfranchises countless voters by leaving them vulnerable to a lack of information and the spread of information. Voter suppression, not always tangible or intentional, seeps into the voting process in varying forms and can begin as soon as one enters formal education. This suppression results from the poor civics education provided to young students, as well as the shifting of the American education system towards a standardized institution, eliminating the inclusive schooling experience that clears a pathway to college for students of all backgrounds. Without proper education, people are less likely to vote, disproportionately affecting minority voters who are often underserved in the education system. Those who are less educated are more likely to be without access to reliable voter information and to be affected by the spread of misinformation regarding elections and voting procedures. Steps that can be taken to improve the education provided to American voters include increasing the U.S. education system's focus on civics, news, and media literacy, bridging minority education gaps, and providing the necessary voter information to voters before an election. Without such improvements, the American education and voting system will continue to suppress voters' democratic voice by failing to provide them with sufficient education.